off. I don't know if you've seen my reaction video to episode 6. You guys wanna see it? You guys wanna see? And I've decided to just upload this this Monday here. The day that I was hoping that everybody would be able to see my reaction video. I don't know whether or not you'll be able to see it. Right. It's probably interesting thing here. When I was looking at the peer thing. Okay, so apparently my video will be made visible immediately. Now, what I'm thinking is that maybe I should just wait to just peel it into like I don't know, like Sunday and all that, since they might be needed with just trying to just reject the appeal or something. Right. But yeah, honestly, but yeah, regardless of whether or not you have you managed to see it, well, I'm just gonna just upload this video anyway. Okay, yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. So basically, yeah, here we are. My throat's feeling a bit sore. I'm also feeling a little tired, but yeah, honestly, it's time for an additional facts video. And so yeah, it's going into just check out just a couple videos here and all that about the Battle of Lexington and Concord. I would probably give myself some coffee, but I don't think it will help. I woke up earlier than usual this morning. Also, got to bed, went to bed later than I should have, so I didn't fully get all the hours of sleep that I should have gotten. Honestly, it's mostly my fault. Well, not mostly. It's half my fault. Half of it is my fault. The other half is just, I guess not my fault. Although, then again, I think it's possible that I could have tried to, got him back to sleep and sleep for a little bit or something. I don't know. I don't know. I'm just feeling a bit tired. Plus, just just the whole issue just it doesn't make me very happy. So yeah, that too. Right. I think I'm going to get that cup of coffee. Alright, got my coffee. Sorry that took so long. I forgot that I needed to make some. I probably shouldn't be drinking coffee so late, but whatever, I'm tired. So by the way, one more thing before we start here. Hey. Yeah, just a few things that I've been that I've wanted to mention, but I haven't. In some of the past episodes here, first, let me just first find the spot here. Something. I don't know. Is this loading? Dang it. wait a minute. Oh, wrong one. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, wrong episode. Completely different one.
So formidable an adversary. Year in the holy cause of liberty, peace. The war is actually begun. There's the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field.
Okay, I'm gonna just. Okay, yeah. One thing I didn't mention here. This little tidbit here.
Fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts.
Yeah, I just kind of like that phrase. Nice little bit biblical there. God of hosts and all that. I just thought that was neat, but I haven't really commented on it in the past. I don't know. I just kind of liked that phrase. An appeal to the God of hosts. Yeah. Okay. And the next thing I want to just mention. Okay. So as you know, some things is that I did not realize it, but I did realize how editing my reaction to this episode is that Power Viz played by Sylvester Stallone. Man, I tell you, I feel like the people just spend a good chunk of their budget just trying to get all these just celebrity guest stars and all that. I mean, I don't know. I just think it's a bit odd and all that. Like, I mean, most kids aren't gonna know who all these A-list celebrities are, and it's not like they bring that a bit something too special to it. I don't know. I guess it is kind of cool, kind of neat, a bit odd. I don't know. Oh, although I gotta say, forget it all. I'll talk about it when I feel a bit chipper and less, tired. And I'm just feeling a bit tired today. Yeah. 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 And besides, this intro is already almost 10 minutes long. You're not here for me to, yammer on. Okay, you came here for the additional facts, didn't you? But don't worry. We're gonna get some additional facts here. Uh-huh. That's right. Tweet. What? Okay. That's right. Two things. In the video by King General and this one by History Rebels. Yeah, that's right. Instead of reading Wikipedia articles and all that, we're going to watch videos. About the Battle of Lexington and Concord and all that. That's where I'm going to get my information from. In all fairness, to be honest, you truly didn't expect that I was some, just well-educated, history professor or anything. Sure, getting primary sources is, always better, but I'm just a dude. I'm just a random guy who just, has a bit of an interest in history and all that. So it's gonna just all be just secondhand sources and just secondhand sources that I can just easily find and all that. I feel like most of the time you just for my opinion, and also maybe you're just too lazy to actually do the research yourself and all that. Like maybe you're lazier than I am and all that. Considering the amount of people who use GPT to cheat on their tests they know and homework. And chances are, you probably are like lazier than I am. But that's enough of that. Let's first try to catch a snippet of this. I'm not gonna like watch the whole thing. I'm just gonna try skipping around and all that. Like the main focus is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Yeah. Right, there we go.
The American Revolution was the seminal moment of the 18th century. It was the culmination of the Enlightenment and would usher in an era of change and revolution. However, it was never intended to become so. That a dispute over taxes would escalate into an era-defining war shocked everyone involved and forever changed the fate of both the new and old worlds. Welcome to the beginning of our series on the American Revolution, where we will tell the tale of miscommunication, misunderstanding, and missed opportunities that led to the birth of a nation. Technically, all this began when someone in Europe figured you could get to Asia by going around the back of the world. The world is
Yeah, but I mean, honestly, I think that's a bit far, don't you think? I mean, don't need to learn everything about Christopher Columbus in order to learn about the American Revolution. All you need to know is that just a bunch of people from the British Isles, decided to sail across the Atlantic Ocean to the North American continent and built a bunch of towns and settlements there, and those settlements grew and expanded and all that. And then you can get your backdrop and all that. And I know you mentioned that the French were doing the same thing and all that, and there was a bit of conflict with the French settlers and the English settlers and all that. And boom, we got the setup for the French and Indian War, or as it's also known as the 7 Years' War, also known as the 9 Years' War. At least I think some people call it the 9 Years' War and all that. Though I believe it's more commonly referred to as the 7 Years' War. Unless you're in North America, then it's French and Indian.
After all, and at least they got that part right. And there's no better way to see it than with our sponsor, Mova Globes. These globes.
Okay, so that's why they start talking about Christopher Columbus. Product placement. I guess in all fairness, this does seem like a very cool product. Kind of neat, a neat little knick-knack. Oh, they got other things, do they?
The Earth's own magnetic field, exposure to ambient light, some crafty use of internal magnets. Magnetic field allows these globes to spin with no cords or batteries, making a beautiful ornament even more impressive. Take a look at their selection at movaglobes.com and use code KINGSANDGENERAL.
Okay, I gotta say that's pretty neat. Yeah. Not neat. Not a bad thing. See, that's somewhat interesting. If I had enough money to just use carelessly and without worry, if I had a bunch of my own money that I can just toss away at random useless knickknacks, then I would definitely get this, especially if they're offering a 10% discount. It's pretty neat if you got enough money to just toss around and throw away all willy-nilly and all that. I'm not that privileged enough to just spend on stuff like that. I mean, I wish I could get one of those things, but I can't. And if you're a rich person, I don't know, get it and all that if you want it. And no, I'm not sponsored by these globe makers. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I just think they're neat. Anyway.
Problem that led to The fundamental underlying problem that led to war between Britain and her colonial subjects was communication. A message sent from North America.
Well, this is an interesting, perspective. I don't know if I've heard about the superior being, taught in a In a variety of ways over the years, they know different, slightly, each way, slightly different from the last. Emphasizing different things and all that. They seem to be, emphasizing miscommunication and all that. Frankly, I think that's a bit given too much benefit of the doubt. I say the real problem, what really caused the American Revolution to happen was the British Parliament and and King George III and all that. I think it was the British government that is to blame. And I'm sure, I understand that that a lot of the colonists are acting quite rowdy and unreasonable, and in some cases quite barbarous. But I think the intolerable acts were a step too far and all that. There's one thing that I'm grateful that has happened because I started reacting to the Liberty Kids and posting it up on YouTube. Is that it led to me making these additional facts videos because I got kind of curious and wanted to just learn more about this and also educate you and all that. I also wanted to just share what knowledge I had about the subject and even share with as much knowledge as I could. And that just led me to do actually just look up what the intolerable acts were and yeah, those acts were intolerable and all that. Absolutely horrible, horrendous, acts. Like seriously, suspending its charter, its colonial charter, Massachusetts colonial charter. That's not. You can't justify that. That's unjustifiable.
Europe on a typical sailing ship of the 17th and 18th century would arrive in about a month, assuming calm seas, favorable winds, and correct navigation.
Oh, I like this historical map here. You get to see so much over there's Poland, and over there's Sweden, owning but a lot of what would be in the modern day Finland, and Denmark, to get our nation at this moment. You still got the Holy Roman Empire and all that real big place. So just Italy's all divided, all messy and all that. A bunch of some of it's independent city-states, some of it's Spanish vassals and all that. Just a nice historical little map of Europe they got here.
Anything less added weeks, if not months, to a voyage. Additionally, the North Atlantic trade winds are westerly, meaning the return trip would take at least twice as long, as ships either had to tack into the wind for a direct return or sail down to Africa to catch the easterly equatorial winds. Therefore, in a crisis, local authorities in the Americas would be on their own for no less than 3 months before British authorities arrived on the scene. Great Britain solved this problem by barely trying to govern its colonies at all. Instead, it handed charters to established colonies along with government powers, the rights of Englishmen and land grants to private individuals and or joint stock companies. Except for a failed attempt to centralize control and administration in New England, London barely interfered in colonial affairs. Control and administration companies. Except for a failed attempt to centralize control and administration in New England, London barely
I'd never heard of that happening. Huh. That's an interesting tidbit. Perhaps I might, look more into that sometime later. Or not. I don't know. I can be a bit lazy and stupid sometimes.
Interfered in colonial affairs. It didn't have the resources to pay appointed governors or station troops in every colony, nor any desire to. This suited the colonists. Interfered in to centralize control and administration in New England, London barely interfered in colonial affairs. It didn't have the resources to pay appointed governors or station troops in every colony, nor any desire to. This suited the colonists, who were left to manage their own affairs via elected legislatures. London didn't even attempt to enforce the Mercantilist Navigation Acts. This period
Mercantilism was the economic theory that all trade benefits should be kept inside the empire to maximize the acquisition of gold and silver reserve.
London didn't even attempt to enforce the Mercantilist Navigation Act.
Okay, so they, didn't even attempt to enforce the mercantilism. So that's interesting. That gives more interesting background to why they were why the people of Boston were even more upset with the whole tea act and all that. I mean, not necessarily the tea tax, but the tea act and all that. And basically just trying to force people to only get tea from the East India Trading Company and all that. Probably because the East India Trading Company wasn't exactly doing very well at the moment, but in so much that the economy was tied up with that one single supermassive corporation that the government was bending backwards to try to help it and prop it up and all that. So yeah.
This period, known as salutary neglect, lasted 70 years. London's neglect wasn't salutary neglect, lasted 70 years.
Okay, 70 years.
London's neglect wasn't simply sloth. The 13 colonies just weren't valuable enough as colonies to bother closely governing.
Yeah, it's the real profit came from the Caribbean and all that, with all the sugar plantations and all that.
The revenue generated by the 13 colonies paled in comparison to the fur trade centered on Canada's Great Lakes and...
Okay, yeah, that's true. The fur trade was also quite big and all that. And also, I wonder if they're going to mention the Caribbean. Wait, but they are. I see a second line coming across here.
Hudson's Bay. Canada, in turn, paled next to the Caribbean sugar colonies.
Yep, that's where the real good amounts of money came from. It was all the sugar trade, growing up in the Caribbean and all that, the Caribbean islands.
Which accounted for 4% of Britain's total gross national product.
So, fun fact, a lot of that sugar was grown using slave labor. Yeah, a lot of enslaved people working there. Not exactly good and all that.
Therefore, London prioritized protecting the Caribbean and Canadian colonies over the American ones. It was rare for the total number of army regulars in North America to exceed 4,000 during peacetime. Most were stationed to protect trading.
So yeah, that explains why people were somewhat a bit shocked and disgusted about the amount of troops running about, leading up to the revolution and all that.
And deter the French in Canada. The rest were scattered in frontier forts and small coastal garrisons, with New York as the Army's headquarters. Local forces were the primary protection for the American colonies against raids by the French and their indigenous allies. The 1754 French and Indian War changed everything.
Oh, interesting. This British person decided to call it the French and Indian War instead of the 7 Years' War. And I would have thought they would have said the 7 Years' War, saying that's the name that Europeans like to give it.
Facing a reinforced and aggressive New France and its allied tribes, representatives from the 7 northern colonies met in Albany on June 19th to plan their war strategy. Also in attendance were representatives of the Iroquois Confederacy, whose continued alliance against the French the colonists were desperate to secure. Despite the delegates' efforts, the Iroquois couldn't actually commit to fighting the French, instead opting for a policy of neutral non-hostility towards the colonies. Next, the delegates' attention turned to a unified war strategy, which...
Guys, I really don't like how well the United States ended up treating the indigenous inhabitants. Like, we really should have just treated them with more respect, especially the ones that actually, allied with the United States and all that against the French and the British. We really, did those poor people, real dirty and all that. We really cheated them and just beat them up and all that. It wasn't fair what we did to them. It was not fair or honorable whatsoever.
Culminated in Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union. While the Plan of Union was approved by all of the colonial delegates, it was unanimously rejected by both the colonial legislatures and the Crown, much to Franklin's frustration. The former wanted more independence, and the latter felt it gave too much. Despite the setbacks, the Congress proved that cooperation between the 13 colonies was possible, even desirable. On September 8, 1760, New France surrendered to British Field Marshal Geoffrey Amherst, ending the war in North America. The American colonists celebrated their rival's fall, especially since it meant expansion. Many colonies already had settlements west of the
which a chunk of it was later denied by by the king himself, which kind of pissed a lot of the colonists off. Honestly, no, I don't think I don't think stopping expansion was too bad and all that. And something honestly, or we can't just, or we shouldn't just grab the whole thing there, especially since there's already people living there and all that. It's just, force them off their land is a bit rude and all that, especially since we already, managed to get a huge chunk of land for ourselves. But, that wasn't the common sentiment at the time. Indeed, humanity often tends to just prioritize its own selfish interest over the interests of others.
Appalachian Mountains, but they had been continuously raided by the French and their indigenous allies. However, with that threat gone, the formerly disputed territory, especially the Ohio River Valley, was now theirs for the taking. However, London felt differently. The earlier conquest of French Arcadia had resulted in extensive and costly guerrilla fighting, and the ongoing 7 Years' War was draining the exchequer. The last thing London wanted was another war. Thus, it needed to very quickly pacify the French Canadians and native peoples. Secondly, the conquest had brought all of the fur trade under British control. While this was a great victory, the fur trade relied on indigenous tribes bringing furs to traders. Without good relations,
you can't do that without, if they don't like you.
Trade was impossible. Britain had always been able to cultivate partnerships with various native tribes by allying with the rivals of French-aligned tribes. That tool was now gone, and it was now entirely on the British.
Suffering from success.
To keep their Indian suppliers happy and protect the fur trade. Unfortunately for London, these goals were thoroughly undermined by Amherst, now the military governor of Canada. Amherst insulted everyone, treating both the French Canadians and French allied tribes poorly.
Oh, that's not good. Amherst took away Catholic rights, suppressed our French culture, and stopped gift-giving to the tribes, assuming they'd be loyal as there was no one else to trade. Well, this guy's an idiot and an asshole. I don't like this guy. Good grief. This guy seems quite arrogant. Very arrogant, imperialistic fellow. I don't really like him too much.
This, coupled with fears of further colonial expansion, ignited Pontiac's War in April 1763, led by the Ottawa chieftain Pontiac against the...
That's what really, just convinced, just the British government to just prevent the colonists from expanding.
British. London finally realized that 156 years after Jamestown was founded, it would have to actually take the policy lead in North America. Preventing conflict was the first step. To this end, Parliament and King George III crafted a royal proclamation to allay the Indians' fears. Unfortunately, it wasn't ready until October 1763, too late to prevent Pontiac's war. However, it did allow Amherst's more conciliatory replacement, Thomas Gage, an opening offer in peace negotiations. The Proclamation of 1763 first established governments for the newly acquired territory in the Americas. Then it divided British North America into 3 pieces. The Proclamation of 1763 first established governments for the newly acquired territory in the Americas. Then it divided British North America into 3 pieces, the 13 colonies, French-speaking Quebec, and Indian Territory.
Huh. Interesting. Hold on a minute. Sorry about that, too many fluids.
British settlers were forbidden within Indian Territory, and the tribe's rights to their land were acknowledged. The official reason was to meet Pontiac's demand to respect Indian land. This wasn't actually true. London fully intended to expand British settlements in North America. However, it would be at London's direction, and only after securing the rights to do so through purchase from the tribes. Parliament...
A bit smart, but a bit sneaking underhanded, but I think it's, a bit smart and careful and all that. Honestly, definitely no. It shows that that none of the British really cared too much about the rights of the natives and all that. No, the interest definitely lied in just profits.
And just couldn't say that openly without angering the Indians, who they were trying to placate. The Proclamation of 1763 caused outrage in the colonies. It ignored their chartered land grants and effectively abandoned the colonial settlements that already existed beyond the Allegheny Mountains. Pontiac's war and fears of a French reconquest of Quebec necessitated the stationing of more troops in North America. Paying for this required new taxes, and since America would...
Oh, I see. This is an interesting, perspective, So that kind of explains it a bit.
Be the beneficiary, the Whig government of George Grenville decided to make the colonies... America would be the beneficiary, the Whig government of George Grenville decided to make the colonies pay. Its first attempt to do this...
English two parties were the centrist Whigs and the conservative Tories. Oh, that's interesting, So it was originally the Whigs' idea to do the tax, not the Tories. I was kind of assumed it was the Tories.
This was the Sugar Act of 1764, which was technically an update to an existing Navigation Act. This drew some protest.
Hold on a minute. And anyway, as we were saying,
from New England rum distillers, but like the Action Act, this drew some protest, which was technically an update to an existing Navigation Act. To make the colonies pay. Its first attempt to do this was the Sugar Act of 1764, which was technically an update to an existing Navigation Act. This drew some protests from New England rum distillers, but like the act it replaced, most colonists simply ignored or dodged the tax. It would be the Stamp Act of 1765 that provoked actual anger.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very intense act there.
Required that all legal paper be purchased from London with a revenue stamp certifying its legality. Though a long-standing tax in Britain, this was the first direct tax placed on any American colonies. It was first announced in April 1764, but not enacted until March 1765. This proved disastrous for Grenville's plan, as the delay in the Act's implementation allowed the colonies time to prepare to resist it. The colonies learned of the Act's passing in early May 1764. By late May, every English-speaking colony from Nova Scotia to Jamaica made clear their intent to resist the tax.
But I wonder, when does Lord North come in? I mean, he does come in around this time. Let's see, what year did Lord North become Prime Minister? Yes. Lord Friedrich North, second Earl of Guilford. Right. I used that from the 50s to the 90s. And it was Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1770 to 1782. Huh. Interesting. Okay, so we gotta just just wait a bit here. I know that. Well, this I guess this is good, interesting. Yeah. Hold on a moment.
In the Caribbean, the strong Royal Navy garrison kept protests muted, though most from Nova Scotia to Jamaica made clear their intent to resist the tax. In the Caribbean, the strong Royal Navy garrison kept protests muted,
in the Caribbean.
though most ports refused to enforce the tax. However, the continental colonies all saw street protests, including the burning in effigy of both tax collectors and the Prime Minister. Boston saw the loudest protests. Beginning with peaceful street demonstrations organized by the nascent Sons of Liberty under James Otis and Samuel Adams, it quickly escalated to violence. Tax collectors were assaulted in the streets, their houses and offices attacked, and even the lieutenant governor was attacked and expelled from his official residence. However, it was New York that planned the most effective resistance to the Stamp Act. In addition to refusing to quarter British troops, the merchants organized a boycott of British goods, the coordination of which was the focus of the Stamp Act Congress in October held in New York City.
Oh, that's interesting. To know that happened. I know that. Well, happened in New York and all that. I mean, elements of it I had a hold of before. Yeah, various elements. Ow, my wrist. Ow. I hope it didn't sprain anything.
It also sent a declaration of rights and grievances that would form the basis of colonial protests over the next 10 years. The declaration laid out the colonial position. Since they were
Right. Colonists owe to the crown the same allegiance owed by subjects born within the realm. Colonists owe to Parliament all due subordination. Colonists possess all the rights of Englishmen. Trial by jury is a right. The use of admiralty courts is abusive. Without voting rights, Parliament could not represent the colonists. There should be no taxation without a representation. Only the colonial assemblies had a right to tax the colonies.
English and guaranteed the rights and privileges thereof, they were only subject to taxation from elected governments. They didn't vote for Parliament, so it could not tax them. Moreover, they had natural rights as human beings, which were being ignored. These principles...
They got closer and you were a patriot. I didn't need to lean forward like that. Oh well.
eventually became the continental rallying cry of no taxation, without representation. This declaration posed a huge threat to Parliament's plans, mostly because it was technically true. During the winter...
Mostly because it was technically true. As in, it was true. They were correct. They were right. Agreements and laws since the Magna Carta clearly stated that the right of taxation derived from the consent of the taxed, and since in 1608 the rights of Englishmen were extended to Scotsmen, there was reason to think they extended to Americans too.
Of 1764, as crisis loomed, Grenville claimed virtual representation solved the problem, for which he was ridiculed.
Politicians never change. Yeah. I can imagine a politician, somewhere, pulling the same kind of nonsense today and all that. Oh my god. Virtual representation claimed that MPs spoke for all British citizens, and not just their constituencies, so they represented everyone. It had little support. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the thing with virtual representation is they don't have to worry about some people voting for you because, the other thing about representation is that you represent them because the people you represent, voted for you to represent them. You're claiming that you represent people who did not vote for you because they can't vote for you. No, that's not how it works at all.
Ridiculed in Parliament and the colonies. This loss of credibility and news of the colonial. Grenville claimed virtual representation solved the problem, for which he was ridiculed in Parliament and the colonies.
Well, even Parliament, what he was saying was stupid. Good grief, this Grenville seems like a complete idiot, just a typical, just your average out-of-touch politician.
Loss of credibility and news of the colonial protests led to the fall of Grenville's government in July 1765.
So then we got Charles Watson Wentworth. So yeah, Grenville went away in 1765.
Colonial protests led to the fall of Grenville's government in July 1765. While the colonies celebrated the Stamp Act's repeal, the next battle loomed. Simultaneous with the repeal, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, stating that Parliament had the same powers in America as it did in July 1765. While the colonies in America as it did in Britain. Parliament intended to try again, and now Townshend had his personal Britain, stating that Parliament had the same powers in America as it did in Britain. Parliament intended to try again, and now Townshend had his personal reputation.
Oh, so that's why it's called the Townshend Acts and all that. Oh, I see. No, I was somewhat, wondered slightly about, the reason why those acts are called the Townshend Acts, and I thought it had to do with the meaning of Townsend. I'd never quite understood what Townsend mean, but I thought it, related to all the things just a term to describe all the various acts that was applied. Yeah. I told him. I had to do something. Then I did another thing. And then I forgot all about this. Got distracted by something else after I did the thing that I did after the thing. But honestly, none of that matters because from your perspective, 0 time has passed. Right. So, now that absolutely nothing has happened, and 0 time has passed, at least for you, and what has transpired for me is, absolutely, just no bearing on you. Does not matter in the slightest. Right. Anyhow, right. Back to the main subject here. I wonder if this video is going to actually, talk about the Battle of Lexington and Concord, or if it's just going to talk about, the stuff that, just led up to it all. Right, yeah.
The next battle loomed. Simultaneous with the repeal, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, stating that Parliament had the same powers in America as it did in Britain. Parliament intended to try again, and now Townsend had his personal reputation to save.
Ah, yes, that's right. The Townsend, who I believe is, as I mentioned already, I have a theory that the Townsend axe are actually named after him. Yeah, I'm feeling thirsty. Get something to drink. There we go, hydrated now. I wonder how many times I've been actually doing this video and all that. And perhaps I ought to, put like a count in the pinned comment down below or something. Or actually, if you've made it this far into the video, I probably I don't know, comment down how many, the number of times. I feel like it's been at least 8. Yeah, right.
Thus, beginning in 1767, the 5 Townsend Acts were passed.
Called it. It's funny, I remember learning about this in school, but and they never said why they were the Townsend Acts. So, honestly, this is basically my reaction to finding out the reason they called the Townsend Acts and all that. Man, in all these years, I thought it was just some old-timey word and all that. But yeah, we got the Revenue Act, the Commissioners of Customs Act, the Indemnity Act, the New York Restraining Act. Oh, I never heard of that one before. And then the Vice Admiralty Court Act.
These acts were intended to raise revenue, tighten Parliament's control of trade, and punish New York for refusing to quarter troops. Once again, there were riots in Boston and widespread boycotts. At the Massachusetts Assembly's behest, numerous colonial legislatures began to send petitions to King George, asking him to intervene and protect their rights as Englishmen. The petitions went nowhere, as the king was firmly on Parliament's side. However, most alarming was the circular letter written by Otis and Adams and passed by the Massachusetts Assembly in February 1768, stating that Parliament was acting unconstitutionally in continuing to tax the colonies without representing them. It was sent to other legislatures to their approval. In response, the colonial acting unconstitutionally in continuing a circular letter written by Otis and Adams and passed by the Massachusetts Assembly in February 1768, stating that Parliament was acting unconstitutionally in continuing to tax the colonies without representing them. It was sent to other legislatures to their approval. In response, the Colonial Secretary, Lord Hillsborough, ordered Massachusetts to withdraw the letter. When it refused, Hillsborough ordered the Assembly dissolved and sent 2,000 troops to occupy Boston that September. Tensions mounted for the next year and a half, especially in occupied and resentful Boston. On the night of March 5th, this resentment boiled over. A guard on duty outside the custom house.
But it's gonna talk about the Boston Massacre. Look at that. Right there in the chapter. I just said it. Called it.
Got into an argument with a wig maker's apprentice, eventually hitting him with his musket. This caused onlookers to begin harassing the guard. The crowd.
Didn't hear that first part.
On the night of March 5th, this resentment boiled over. A guard on duty outside the custom house got into an argument with a wig maker's apprentice, eventually hitting him with his musket. This caused onlookers to begin harassing the guard. The crowd kept growing, and he retreated.
I not heard about, it starting out as an argument or anything like that. I wonder what the sources are and all that.
Up the steps and called for help. Captain Thomas Preston soon arrived with 7 soldiers and ordered the crowd of several hundred to disperse. Instead, the crowd started throwing snowballs, rocks, and insults at the soldiers. Then innkeeper Richard Palms, carrying a cudgel, approached Preston, asking if the soldiers' muskets were loaded. Preston said they were, but they'd only fire on his order. Just then, a missile knocked down Private Hugh Montgomery. Dazed, he retrieved his musket, shouted, "Damn you, fire!" and fired. Palms then swung his cudgel at Montgomery, hitting his arm, then at Preston, also hitting his arm. After a pause, the rest of the soldiers opened fire.
Okay, yeah, let's listen to that again.
Hugh Montgomery. Dazed, he retrieved his musket, shouted, "Damn you, fire!" and fired.
Okay, now from the stories I've heard, it was a bit more chaotic than that. Also, I think they're oversimplifying some things here a bit. I mean, honestly, from what I've heard is that nobody's quite sure who has said fire first, and that person said no fire and all that. Or at least there was confusion about who has said fire and all that.
Palms then swung his cudgel at Montgomery, hitting his arm, then at Preston, also hitting his arm. After a pause, the rest of the soldiers opened fire. 3 Americans died instantly, and 2 more would die of their wounds. Both sides called for reinforcements, and a full riot seemed imminent. Order was only restored when the governor himself arrived at the custom house and promised an investigation. A trial ultimately resulted in 2 soldiers being found guilty of manslaughter. News of the incident spread like wildfire and was immediately used as anti-Parliament propaganda, with Paul Revere's engraving calling it the Boston Massacre, the most well-known. The propaganda worked, and anti-Parliament sentiment spread rapidly. By coincidence, on the same day as the massacre, the recently appointed Tory Prime Minister, Lord North,
and now we get to the famous one here.
repealed most of the Whig Townsend Acts, citing lack of revenue they generated. However, he kept the tax on tea and the Boston garrison intact, and further signalled to the colonies that this was the new status quo. Parliament was done backing down. In response, the colonies continued organising. The Committees of Correspondence, first set up by the Sons of Liberty to coordinate opposition to the Stamp Act, became more active and spread to more colonies. However, 1771 and 1772 were otherwise quiet, and it looked like the conflict might be allowed to burn out. However, Lord North wasn't finished. In May 1773, the Tea Act was passed. Not a tax, it instead allowed the British East India Company the right to sell unlimited tea to the 13 colonies at a discount. However, the colonies saw it for what Lord North intended it to be, a ploy to get them to buy more tea, paying the tea tax, and implicitly accepting Parliament's right to tax them. This led nearly every colony...
Also, it basically just kind of just made it, also just encouraged people to only, it encouraged the majority of people to just only buy tea from the East India Trading Company as well and all that. Promoting monopolism and all that.
To refuse tea to be landed in their ports. Boston went further again, with the Boston Tea Party on December 16th. This was the final straw for North, who decided that harsh action needed to be taken to put the colonies in their place. Massachusetts, and especially Boston, would be made an example. The fuse of revolution was now lit. At the next session of Parliament, the 5 intolerable acts were passed. The first 4, called the Coercive Acts, all directly punished Boston, closing the city port, placing it under military governance, allowing officials to try anyone in British courts rather than local ones, and requiring more extensive troop quartering. To enforce these acts, General Gage was appointed governor of Massachusetts and ordered to consolidate his garrisons in Boston and move his headquarters there, which was accomplished in May 1774. This would not produce the results London intended. Gage had been stationed in North America since 1755, only occasionally returning to Britain, and was quite sympathetic to the colony's grievances. He would try to separate his duties as governor from his duties as an occupier, to little effect. It was the Fifth Act that would prove most damaging to Britain's hold on the colonies. Unrelated to the coercive acts, but passed at the same session, the Quebec Act outraged all parts of colonial society, even Parliament's strongest defenders. To placate the Canadians, the Act restored rights to Catholics in Quebec, allowed the use of French civil law, and most importantly, expanded Quebec's borders to include...
Yeah, we already heard about this and all that. Yeah, I feel like, this is just mostly going on over the majority of the stuff that we've already looked at.
towards the Sons of Liberty and the Patriot Camp. On September 5th, delegates from every colony but Georgia met in Philadelphia for the first...
Oh, yes, that's right. Every colony but Georgia, yes. Yes, I had almost forgotten about that. As I kind of had forgotten about that. It's little details that often get forgotten about the most.
Continental Congress. After first issuing the Declaration of Rights, they agreed to resist the intolerable acts via a complete boycott of British imports, and to pressure the West Indies colonies to do the same. Congress then adjourned with an agreement to reconvene the next year if their grievances weren't addressed. The boycott quickly put enormous pressure on Lord North to back down. However, with the King solidly behind him, North refused to budge, even as British exports to America plummeted. Whether the boycott could have worked will never be known, as events in Boston overtook everyone. Even before arriving in Boston, Gage realized that his position was impossible. He had roughly 3,000 soldiers in Boston, which was more than needed to keep order in a city of 16,000, but far too few to control the countryside. He was effectively trapped in Boston and lacked the authority or resources to change his situation. He refused to actively oppress the population, but couldn't negotiate with them either. Instead, he hoped removing the colonists' ability to fight would reduce their resistance. On September 1st,
And this is now the events that led up to Lexington and Concord. I'm gonna say, even though this video did not focus as much on the Battle of Lexington and Concord as I hoped it would, the background details definitely do, shed much more light on the whole ordeal.
1774, Gage dispatched 260 soldiers to seize the Powder House, the largest gunpowder magazine in Massachusetts, a few miles northwest of Boston. After capturing and removing the powder without resistance, a contingent stopped in Cambridge to seize 2 cannons. The next day, a crowd of thousands of militiamen swarmed Cambridge, acting on rumors of British regulars attacking Boston and worse. This forced several prominent loyalists to flee into the city for military protection. As facts became clearer, the militia dispersed, with Gage understandably perturbed by the swiftness and scale of the response. He didn't know that he was under constant surveillance by the Sons of Liberty, now led by Dr. Joseph Warren. He soon learned that...
Oh, yes. Yes, he appeared in the Midnight Ride episode.
Other colonies were moving their militia stores further inland, away from his reach. Massachusetts militia also moved their unseized cannons out of Boston to Concord and began looking for more powder to replace the lost stores. Soon learned that other colonies were moving their militia stores further inland, away from his reach. Massachusetts militia also moved their unseized cannons out of Boston to Concord and began looking for more powder to replace the lost stores. Realizing the situation, Gage resolved to take no further provocative action. Unfortunately, Parliament had contrary plans. In February 1775, King George declared before both houses of Parliament that a state of rebellion existed in Massachusetts. Immediately afterwards, Secretary of State William Legge ordered Gage to quash the rebellion, disarm the militia, disband the Massachusetts Assembly, and arrest their leaders.
No, I guess I do wish they, kind of focus on, on that in the show a bit more. Because honestly, in a way, it kind of just makes get age look more of a look more like a villain than he actually was in real life. Hmm.
How was left to Gage's discretion, but it was to be done as quickly as possible. In the next episode of our History on the American Revolution, Paul Revere will go on his midnight ride, and Continental militias will clash with the British at Bunker Hill. To ensure you do not miss that,
Okay, so they will talk about Lexington and Concord in the next video, or not at all. Yeah. Let's see here. Mm-hmm. Huh. Oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting fact right here. Oh. Hmm. I just noticed there's a video right here about the battles of Lexington and Concord. Huh. Hey. Hmm. Hmm. Right. Well, first let's see if it's mentioned at all in the next one, and then we'll go to the other video. Right.
Sparkling Ice Flavor Lab, Stella speaking.
Skip. Let's see.
on April 14, 1775, British General Thomas Gage received orders to quash the rebellion, disband the Massachusetts.
Hmm. And I think we'll, stop watching this video at the, let's say the, how about at the 10-minute mark here? Hmm. Yeah. Or perhaps sooner. Hmm. Right. Let's just, yeah. This video is already over now, so and I think we ought to just get right to it now. Right.
Provincial Congress and arrest resistance leaders, notably Samuel Adams and the British General Thomas Gage received orders.
I wonder why the map looks so different now than it did in the last video here.
To quash the rebellion.
In fact, all the graphics look completely different. I wonder why.
Disband the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and arrest resistance leaders, notably Samuel Adams and John Hancock. This dismayed Gage, for he knew that any attempt to arrest colonial leadership or disband their assemblies would trigger riots, if not open rebellion. Unwilling to simply refuse orders, Gage instead elected to use his granted discretion to modify the mission, rather than a campaign to...
Let's see here. So his orders were to quash the rebellion, disband Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and arrest the resistance leaders. So, yeah, there's no way any of that's was possibly happening, not with the number of troops he had. Yeah. I mean, that would is just begging for all the colonists to just go up and start rioting and rebelling.
Rebellion. Unwilling to simply refuse orders, Gage instead elected to use his granted discretion to modify the mission. Rather than a campaign to root out the rebellion, for which there weren't enough soldiers in all the Americas, he would instead disarm the militia via a swift raid. He hoped removing their ability to fight would sap their will to revolt and put an end to Massachusetts's defiance. He was
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and unfortunately for Gage, no, the whole just take all the big guns and just gunpowder and all that, and ammunition. I know that whole plot was discovered by the colonists, and as a result, and they went towards Lexington and Concord to just stop the whole plan from succeeding.
gathered his officers and on the evening of April 18th, General Gage gathered his officers and informed them of the operation. 700 infantry, consisting of a vanguard of elite light infantry and the main body of grenadiers, would cross the Mystic River by boat, then march 17 miles to Concord, destroy all military supplies, and return. Mounted patrols had already been dispatched to scout the area and set roadblocks. Unfortunately for Gage, the Sons of Liberty discovered his intentions almost immediately, and Dr. Joseph Warren dispatched Paul Revere and William Dawes to spread the alarm. Dawes went south via the Boston Neck, while Revere rode north across the Mystic. The two men met up just outside Cambridge and continued to Lexington to warn both the local militia and Adams and Hancock, who were hiding in the village. Messengers were then sent out to alert neighboring towns to turn out their militia. After the message was delivered, Dawes and Revere continued on to Concord, joined by resident Dr. Samuel Prescott. Unfortunately, the men ran into a British roadblock. Revere was captured, but Dawes and Prescott fled into the woods. Dawes fell from his horse, but Prescott successfully made it to...
So that's what Prescott, I just went farther than either Revere or Dawes. Huh. That's interesting.
Concord around 3 a.m. By now, militia companies all over Massachusetts were marshalling toward Concord. By the time the British regulars completed their crossing and began their march at 2 a.m. on the 19th, their mission was effectively a failure. All usable stores were removed from Concord within a few hours of Prescott's arrival, and only a few bags of old musket balls and 3 24-pounder siege cannons, too heavy to move on broken gun mounts, remained. The vanguard arrived in Lexington around heavy usable stores were removed from musket balls and 3 24-pounder siege cannons, too heavy to move on broken gun mounts, remained. The vanguard arrived in Lexington around 5 a.m. to find 80 militia assembled on the village green, but not blocking the road. Instead of marching past, the soldiers moved onto the green in front of the militia to prevent a flank attack. The two sides simply stared at each other while a British officer started ordering the militia to disperse. Then a shot rang out. No one knows who fired the shot heard around the world, but the British regulars responded to it by firing a volley and charging the Continental Line. By the time Major Pitcairn regained control of his soldiers, 8 militiamen lay dead on the green.
That pretty much lines up what happened in the show, huh?
With little other choice, the British column continued on to Concord as news of Lexington spread. Knowing they were outnumbered, the 250 militiamen with little other militiamen lay dead on the green. With little other choice, the British column continued on to Concord as news of Lexington spread. Knowing they were outnumbered, the 250 militiamen already in Concord retreated across the North Bridge to await
which they then tried to destroy.
More reinforcements. allowing the British to search the empty town. After destroying the cannon's mounting points,
I see. So that kind of explains, what was going on and all that. And it seemed a bit confusing, all that. What was going on in the episode and all that. Yeah, I mean, even after editing it, whole buttons and all that, and just which of course kind of made you see some of the scenes, and this led to a slightly better understanding of the course of events. It still was kind of confusing exactly what was going on with Concord. So now it all makes sense.
The regulars threw the musket balls into a pond and burned the gun carriages. As the smoke from the fire rose, the militia, after destroying the cannon's mounting points, the regulars threw the musket balls into a pond and burned the gun carriages. As the smoke from the fire rose, the militia moved back towards the bridge.
I see. That all.
Now numbering 400. The British Light Company holding the bridge retreated across and formed defensive positions, and another standoff ensued. Towards the bridge, now numbering 400. The British Light Company holding the bridge retreated across and formed defensive positions, and another standoff ensued. Then a shot was fired from the British side. Again, this set off the regulars, who fired off a volley without orders. But unlike at Lexington, this time the militia returned fire.
Okay. That's interesting. Well, then I guess that just proves how, knowledgeable I was. Since, I thought when it came to Lexington and all that, I thought that the militiamen, fired back at Lexington and all that. Apparently, that does not seem to be the case. Well, I guess that just shows how much I know. Okay.
With the most toys.
Okay, yeah, let's see. Skip.
Massachusetts, Prescott, Town,
Oh, wait a minute.
Hancock, who were high them
I went too
got
far
right
back.
on the green.
Yeah, that's
Continued
right.
the two
Instead of hitting forward, I was hitting back the whole
Mount-
time.
Number from the
Silly me.
British side.
Yeah, can I not tell my fronts from my back? Good grief. Huh. I just gotta do with this again. Huh. It's the same exact ads as before. Those are the same ads as the last time. Huh. Right.
The British Light Company holding the bridge retreated across and formed defensive positions, and another standoff ensued. Then a shot was fired from the British side. Again, this set off the regulars, who fired off a volley without orders. But unlike at Lexington, this time the militia returned fire. The regulars' leadership, leading from the front, quickly went down, and the leaderless and exhausted soldiers fled back towards an oncoming relief column. The militia then pulled back and allowed the relief force to recover their wounded. By 11:30,
No wonder if it tells how many wounded was there. No, it didn't say the casualties of Concord and all that.
the search was complete, and the order to return to Boston was given. However, the countryside was now swarming with nearly 2,000 outraged.
Yeah, I remember hearing this from and the oversimplified videos about the American Revolution and all that.
Militiamen. As the British column marched back, militiamen ambushed them from every bush, fence, wall, and tree, ultimately causing around 300 casualties. By the afternoon of the 19th, the British met with reinforcements and escaped into Boston, while still growing militia forces made camp outside. Boston was now under siege by rebel forces, as the militia force swelled to 4,000.
So that reminds me of a certain Alright, for this song here. That's it.
Turn them back and chase those
So
redcoats back to
Boston
Boston.
town. Yep. We chased those redcoats back to Boston town.
With Gage's worst fears having become a reality, the mild general characteristically tried to defuse the situation by appeasing both sides, playing at being both Britain's general and Massachusetts' civilian governor. On the civil side, Gage refused to impose martial law or take any action against opposition newspapers and leaders, instead crafting a deal with city aldermen to surrender any remaining personal weapons in exchange for safe passage out of Boston. On the military side, Gage immediately began building fortifications on the Boston Neck and sent reinforcements to Charlestown to fortify the heights, which would ultimately be abandoned after Gage decided to tighten his lines. Next, he sent orders to the remaining garrisons in Canada to send surplus troops to reinforce him in Boston, then dispatched requests to London for reinforcements. Unbeknownst to Gage, the request was superfluous. A British force of 4,500, led by Major Generals William Howe, John Burgoyne and George Clinton, had been dispatched to Boston along with a Royal Navy squadron in March. London had intended to send the force alongside delivering Gage his initial orders to crush the rebellion, but it had been delayed, first by difficulties putting the troops together and then finding officers to lead them. Howe was ill-fit for command, but he was the most senior general willing to do so. Every general above him was either too old to go to America or too opposed to Prime Minister Lord North's policies.
Well, I think that's a sign that your policies are pretty, and all that. Good grief, and it just shows, just how incompetent, a Prime Minister Lord North was.
Like others among British military brass, Howe was no fan of the Prime Minister. However, his sense of duty trumped personal attachment, and when asked by King George III,
Oh, man. Isn't that telling? Even in British Army officers didn't like North.
third, he accepted the command. By the morning of April, accepted the command. He trumped personal attachment, and when asked by King George III, he accepted the command. By the morning of April 20th, approximately 16,000 members of the Massachusetts militia, now commanded by Massachusetts Commander-in-Chief, Major General Artemus Ward, were loosely assembled in the hills surrounding Boston.
I think we'll stop this video right here. Let's hear a bit more about the Battle of Lexington and Concord here. Yeah, this video ought to be a bit more in depth.
It's 1775, and the plains of North America have been thrust into war. From Lexington to Yorktown, brother will fight brother as the once loyal 13 colonies fight for the mother country or for liberty and a new era. This is the story of the American Revolution. Join us as we explore the key battles, the strategies, and the politics that will one day lead to the birth of a nation.
So dramatic. It's kind of funny how pretty much the only videos I could find on the subject both made by British and all that, just both this guy and the other guys are all British and all that, and you can't seem to find any videos made by Americans.
Over 150 years before the Battle of Lexington and the shots that will start the American Revolution, Europeans first began colonizing the Americas.
Okay, let's just
60% of the male European population are eligible to vote, a far higher and fundamental rights divided by the leading powers of Europe. The British colonists bring with them a democratic tradition and fundamental rights.
Yeah, yeah. And I think let's just skip ahead to Boston here.
In Boston, riots break out, leading to the deployment of the regular army to protect local officials. Tensions boil over in the city, and an angry crowd provokes soldiers into firing. 5 colonists lay dead in what will soon become known as the Boston Massacre. Although the soldiers, known locally as regulars, are removed from Boston, tensions in the city remain high. 3 years later, to protest laws that undercut the price of smuggled ships, the British government's reaction is swift and will soon become known as the Intolerable Acts, which includes replacing self-governance in Massachusetts. However, instead of discouraging further acts of rebellion, the Intolerable Acts lead to the First Continental Congress in October, set across the colonies to discuss a united response.
You know, I gotta say, I do like the music that he's using. Yeah, this is royalty-free music created by Kevin MacLeod. Right here. You know, I wonder if he credits the music here. Let's see here. Music. And you know, I don't know if you could hear it, but no, I just heard a little bit of the music that was just being played in the background here. Doesn't look like he doesn't look like there's any credit here. Let's see. Yeah, but if you just turn it up enough and listen closely enough, you can definitely hear a little bit of the royalty-free music. Created by Kevin MacLeod.
Delegates meet from across the colonies to discuss a united response. Those who desire independence, known as patriots, are still in the minority, as most representatives still do not want to break from the crown. But Parliament's arrogance must be confronted, and a resolution is made to boycott British goods until the Intolerable Acts are repealed.
It's a bit louder now.
In Boston, more extreme measures are taken. The now disbanded Colonial Assembly forms the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and starts training a militia for war.
I forgot the name of the music that's playing in the background, but I've heard it a few times in the past. I wish I could remember the name. I at least know the name of the composer and all that. So, I think after a little bit of time, you may be able to find the answer to the question yourself.
Massachusetts is declared to be an open rebellion by the new British authorities, who occupy the city of Boston, but little else. The scene is set for a showdown between Parliament and the colonies. British General Thomas Gage is dispatched to Boston to take command of the quickly deteriorating situation. He knows the land well, having fought the French in North America years earlier alongside colonists like George Washington. Although suppressing rebellions and fighting wars in different continents is nothing new to the British Army, few of Gage's 4,000 men have seen actual combat. The general quickly begins regular patrols across the countryside from his headquarters in Boston in a show of force to the rebel Provincial Congress and to boost the morale of his own beleaguered forces. But General Gage does not want war, and he plans to prevent it by capturing or destroying military supplies in lightning raids across Massachusetts. These raids have limited success and mostly serve to help better organize the colonial militias, with many units now being designated as Minutemen, who are able to rapidly respond to British movements. Confrontations between British regulars and colonial forces remain bloodless, and where the forces do meet, they only trade insults, with the occasional fistfight breaking out. The regulars are used to seeing armed militia protests, which are a common feature of colonial life, where locals demonstrate their rights as Englishmen as opposed to threatening violence.
Interesting. So already, getting some more in-depth details here, and all of that.
In March 1775, however, the more radical Massachusetts Provincial Congress decides that any large British force leaving Boston is now to be opposed with armed resistance. At the same time, Gage receives his own escalatory orders from an intransigent government in London to disarm the colonial militias and imprison the ringleaders, setting the two sides on a collision course. Gage hatches a plan to capture the rebel leadership and large military stores in the nearby town of Concord. In one fast and secret expedition, he hopes to deal a fatal blow to the nascent colonial revolt. He prepares a small force of 700 men under Lieutenant Colonel Smith, giving him strict instructions to respect the rights of local inhabitants and their private property, but also to request reinforcements if resistance is met.
Yeah, let's see. Let's back that up here and get a better idea what he was saying here.
Fast and secret expedition, he hopes to deal a fatal blow to the nascent colonial revolt. He prepares a small force of 700 men under Lieutenant Colonel Smith, giving him strict instructions to respect the rights of local inhabitants and their private property, but also to request reinforcements if resistance is met. But the Massachusetts rebels had been expecting such a move, and the evening before the raid, patriots catch wind of the plans in Boston and ride out to warn the Congress leadership and militias, narrowly avoiding British patrols.
Appears that he neglected to say, who these patrolmen were and the routes they took. Well, I guess it just goes to show that one should always try to get the information from multiple sources and all that, so that way, they'll be able to get as many details as possible. Although I know oftentimes people do tend to gloss over the details that they believe to be less important. Ooh, nice atmospheric sound here. Quite nice.
Because the land route to Concord is closely watched by rebel sympathizers, in the early hours of the 19th of April, Smith's force row across the bay in an attempt to maintain the element of surprise. They disembark into waist-deep water and by 2 a.m. begin their 18-mile march to Concord in soaking boots. Because no resistance is expected to speed up their movements, each soldier is carrying limited ammunition, a decision that will prove disastrous later in the day. As the British march,
yeah, I believe that.
colonial riders are spotted moving west ahead of the column.
Those would be our boys, Revere and Oz.
Smith then hears reports from his forward units that large militia forces are gathering at Lexington, unnerving news which quickly spreads throughout the ranks. Smith knows they've lost the element of surprise and sends word back to Boston asking for reinforcements. As British forces arrive in Lexington,
and I just realized, you can see, you can see that there's a, that in the corner over here, it shows the time of all the events and all that. I guess it just is, 3 a.m., 2 a.m., and all that, 12 a.m. So, so it starts at 12 a.m., the British, row us to, the land at about 1 a.m., walk past, Cambridge by 2 a.m., they're over here, and, at Minnetomy, Yeah, by 3 a.m.
Moving west ahead of the column. Smith then hears a decision that will prove disastrous later in the day. As the British march, colonial riders are spotted moving west ahead of the column. Smith then hears reports from his forward units that large militia forces are gathering at Lexington, unnerving news which quickly spreads throughout the ranks. Smith knows they've lost the element of surprise and sends word back to Boston asking for reinforcements. As British forces arrive in Lexington, the town's militia is present. As with previous confrontations,
Excuse me a moment. It's a good thing I remembered. I almost forgot to unpause for a second there. What the heck? Yeah. 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 My voice sounds. Ugh.
unnerving news which quickly spreads throughout the ranks. Asking for British forces arrive in Lexington, the town's militia is present. As with previous confrontations, neither side expect bloodshed, and the militia of 80 men, under the command of John Parker, is purposefully not blocking the road to Concord or intending to fight regular troops. Parker tells his men, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Without orders, a British advance guard moves on to Lexington Common,
Oh, without orders.
instead of marching past to Concord. Commanders on both sides tell their men not to fire, and the militia is told to disperse. 100 local spectators watch on curiously as the two forces casually hurl insults at each other. As the militiamen slowly begin to leave, a single shot rings out from somewhere on the surrounding common. In the immediate confusion, other shots start to be fired from both sides until the British company volley fires without orders. Although those on the field do not yet know it, the first blood has been spilt of the American Revolutionary War, and 8 militiamen lay dead on Lexington Common.
Okay, so this has definitely been a very informative evening, quite educational.
Smith regains control of the situation and berates his stunned officers, reminding them of Gage's orders. The troops are recalled, and the march continues apace to Concord. The day is young, and Smith hopes they can still complete their mission, despite the unwelcomed setback at Lexington. Upon arrival into Concord, the British search buildings where residents.
Oh, so that's I think it's the movement of the militia at first.
At Lexington. Upon arrival into Concord, the British search buildings where residents give them permission and burn the small amounts of contraband they can find. But there are no rebel leaders or large military stores, as anything and anyone of value has been dispersed hours earlier by the rebels. By 9 a.m., 400 colonial militia have concentrated in the surrounding hills under the command of Colonel Barrett. They have heard rumors of the events at Lexington and now see smoke coming from Concord.
They think they're blowing the town.
Assuming that the regulars are
Got it.
burning the town, many are surprised and angered by the apparent escalation, but they are not afraid to meet fire with fire. The exhausted British regulars resting in the town are still unaware of the dramatic change of sentiment or of the large numbers of militia that are slowly surrounding their position. Now watched on by the evacuated townspeople, Barrett and the militia resolve to save the town, and they advance. Barrett's force quickly rout the 90 regulars holding the bridge, but lightly stunned by both the escalation and their success, they fall back to the hill and regroup.
So, someone tells me that the British suffered no casual, and that nobody none of the British, regulars, died at the bridge. So it appears that detour was entirely made up for the show. Just for dramatics and all that. Just add a little just flavor of emotionality and tragedy. Yeah, a bit. Hmm. Hmm. And so, that is the thing with historical fiction. Is that oftentimes it definitely likes to be a bit more fictional than historical. Yeah.
There are now over 1,000 militia surrounding Concord, and Smith knows it is time to leave.
Mm-hmm.
The regulars spread out beyond the road for protection and start the march back.
I hope I'm not speaking too quietly. I was thinking that then I do somewhat worry if I'm speaking a bit too quietly.
Towards Lexington, but columns of militia are ominously shadowing their movements, and a race begins to the first bridge. The situation has now seriously changed for Smith and his men, who were perilously outnumbered and far away from the safety of Boston Harbor. Shots start to ring out, and the regulars take casualties as they cross the bridge.
Yeah, I think I'm circling here. Let me just pick it up and...
Over 1,000 militia surrounding Concord. There are now over 1,000 militia surrounding Concord, and Smith knows it is time to leave. The regulars spread out beyond the road for protection and start the march back towards Lexington. But columns of militia are ominously shadowing their movements, and a race begins to the first bridge. The situation has now seriously changed for Smith and his men, who were perilously outnumbered and far away from the safety of Boston Harbor. Shots start to ring out, and the regulars take casualties as they cross the bridge. British skirmishers attempt to flank the militia, who position themselves well behind walls, trees, and undergrowth. Those they catch are killed, but most of the militiamen have spent years fighting and living in the rugged terrain of North America and delivered disciplined and effective musket fire before moving position. As the speed of march increases in sheer desperation, the regulars are repeatedly ambushed by the now over 2,000 strong militia. Casualties are starting to mount as the British tactical formations are no use in the wooded countryside, and what little ammunition they have starts to run low. They spread out where they can, but at narrow passes, like at the now infamous Bloody Angle, discipline and cohesion starts to break down as the force fights for its life. The Lexington militia under Parker, who was scattered by the British just 8 hours earlier, are now back and ready for revenge. Parker prepares his men well in a wooded hill overlooking the road. As they open fire, the British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Smith, is hit in the leg and falls from his horse, wounded. Desperate fighting continues up to a last ambush outside of Lexington, where the British, now exhausted from 14 hours of marching and fighting, are on the verge of surrender. Smith and his men stagger into town, defeated by their superior tactics, tenacity, and the sheer numbers of colonial militia. But just as all hope seems...
that Kevin McLeod music is back. Listen closely for it. Oh, I just heard it.
...lost, cheers erupt in the British ranks. Smith's message for reinforcements has been answered. Under the command of Earl Percy, 1,000 British regulars are now surrounding Lexington with 2 field guns. Percy, taking overall command, reorganizes Smith's battered force and rests them in the town. But the battle is not over, and although reinforced, the British are still hopelessly outnumbered by the now 4,000-strong colonial militia, who show no signs of being cowed by the presence of British reinforcements. Percy soon continues the march, with Smith's battered formation in the middle of the column. A militia general, William Heath, arrives to take overall command of the colonial forces.
Oh.
He orders the militia to now avoid large British formations because of the threat posed by the deadly field guns. Heath's forces must continually rotate to engage the British along the road, a time-consuming and difficult maneuver to carry out.
Oh.
Desperate street
Wow. That's impressive. Huh.
fighting and bloody hand-to-hand combat occurs as the British column enters the town of Monotony. Some atrocities are committed by the desperate and frightened British troops as each building is cleared of sharpshooters.
Wow.
Many are killed on both sides in Monotony, including one militiaman who dies fighting from his home, telling his comrades an Englishman's home is his castle. The militia has large forces organised and waiting at Cambridge, but Percy decides instead to march towards Charlestown, rightfully cautious of a trap. As the final hill is cleared of militia, the British column limps into Charlestown, to the safety of Boston Harbour and Royal Navy guns. The First Battle of the American Revolution is over, and although it saw relatively minor casualties on both sides,
So the British got 73 dead, 227 missing, and wounded. So a total of 300. Well, with the colonials, it's 49 dead, 94 missing and wounded. A total of 93. So wow, the British really suffered a lot for and all of it. It's oof.
the battle is nonetheless monumental. The war has now begun, and as the Patriot leader, John Adams, later writes, the die is cast and the Rubicon crossed. In the aftermath of the battle, and in what must have felt like the world turning upside down, trenches and redouts are dug around the city, and Boston is put to siege. In the
I gotta say, I definitely really appreciate, checking this video because, I definitely learned. Because the other video is a bit informative about Lexington and Concord. This, I feel like I really got to know everything that happened there and all that. Like, after they leave for like, Concord, usually, when people talk about it, they just, gloss over like, oh, yeah, and then, the British ran away while being, hit by the, Americans and all that who started firing upon them. And just hit and run tactics and all that and guerrilla warfare. They really just kind of gloss over here, but, with this, he definitely went into the details, which was very much appreciated and all that. Because that's exactly what I wanted to know, all the details.
siege. In the days and weeks following the battle, volunteers from all over the 13 colonies marched to join the army, and the militia transforms into a truly American force for the first time. Although they may lack the equipment and the professionalism of a modern army, they have nonetheless succeeded in their first test of what will soon become a grueling war. General Gage's strategy to prevent conflict has dramatically failed, along with the British government's plan to force colonial compliance without the consent of its people. In London, Parliament quickly blames Gage for recklessly starting a civil conflict, despite the fact he was
Oh, good grief, no, it's a fucking parliament. Seriously, he was following your orders, you stupid, pricks, and all the, all those silly, snogglers, horn from bumblers, and other and all just ridiculous individuals. Oh, good grief.
following their orders. And even as the shots at Lexington are heard around the world, Parliament's position will not budge, and British reinforcements are soon dispatched to the colonies.
The more you learn about, what Parliament was doing, during the American Revolution, you truly begin to understand just how the British, lost the war and all that, and how the British caused the war to happen and all that. Like, it's all, it truly is all just the fault of the Parliament and all that, and the King and all that. Just, yeah. Yeah. Just at the end of the day, it's the politicians who just cause the whole mess and all that, and a good deal of people just pay dearly for the mistakes of the politicians and all that. Now, isn't that a tale as old as time?
What started out as civil and legal arguments over rights and taxation has now transformed into outright war in Massachusetts. The opening battle has ended in colonial victory, but the battle at Lexington is just the beginning, and the British will soon strike back. Thank you for watching our series on the American Revolution.
Well, gotta say, I really enjoyed this video, and I do hope to just watch some more and all that. I wonder if I'll check out extra histories video, but then I think I'll just watch this video right here, on my own time. Actually, yeah. With all that all said and done, I guess I'll end the video now. So I guess have a good day, and just have a good day and good night.